little Scandinavia or not, prison is on your record. And they don't, like, an employer isn't going to be like, oh, you were in the little Scandinavia model. Like, oh, you must be a great employee. Like, no, the stigma's still there. And so that's
Right.
the question that we have to like ask is, even if we move toward implementing great programs in prison, the stigma of prison doesn't go away. Welcome to episode 5 of Office Hours with Abbie and Juwan. We often frame the idea of prison abolition around the care of those incarcerated. So we talk about how it's unethical to incarcerate individuals in these conditions. Yet we forget or we omit that those very conditions are the same that individuals are working within. And so the same kind of stress and trauma that individuals are being subjected to in prisons, correctional officers are being subjected to as well. And while, of course, it's different and varying to the degree, those same stressful conditions, the loud noises, the feelings of threat and danger are all encompassing to everyone involved. And so I think that's often something that's absent from the conversation around abolition that we need to talk about, even when it comes to police. Like, we have data from the National Institute of Health that demonstrates that correctional officers have much higher levels of PTSD, depression, and suicide than the general population, and have a life expectancy of 59 years old compared to like the 75 of the rest of the population. So when we talk about why thinking of something different and better is to the benefit of everyone, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah, I love that critique that Dr. Hyatt gave because, we're so enthralled in the work. I work with a lot of people who have life sentences, but it just dawned on me. My dad's been a correctional officer in Philadelphia for as long as I've been lived. That's over 30 years. And my brother is a Philadelphia police officer. And my dad would oftentimes tell me when I was younger, he was like, there's really no difference between people who are incarcerated and himself, is that he just gets to go home at the end of the night. And so he was subject to eating some of the same food, right? Which he had like health issues for eating some of the same food. He oftentimes felt though, like, because of the shift work that he kind of just was kind of coming home and going back, and also seeing the toll that it takes on his body, and also knowing a lot of his colleagues who have retired, who have died shortly after that. And so, we just haven't done a good job of kind of really thinking about the people that work in the conditions. Also, which is so fascinating. My brother's a police officer. He went to a training, and we oftentimes talk about how people in the community, especially Black men, thinking about all the unarmed shootings are, people are traumatized, dealing with so many different social issues that are kind of pressing down on them. But it was really interesting. They were saying like during a shift, and I'm not sure to the number, but it's approximately that police officers will experience 7 to 10 traumatic events
Yeah.
in their during their tour, or during their patrolling on their shift. And so it's interesting that you have police officers who are experiencing several traumatic experiences while they're patrolling, and are oftentimes dealing with people in the community who are already traumatized. And the same thing in the correctional spaces. Like I often wonder how many events or how many times that correctional officers are traumatized themselves on the things that they see, and are also working with populations that are also traumatized. And I think that's something we haven't give credence to. And I think a lot of times we turned our focus into people who are incarcerated, but oftentimes we never have thought about that the system is affecting more people than just the people who get arrested.
Yeah. Something that just came to me while you were talking was thinking about how, so I made a TikTok about this
So,
very thing. And it was, first of all, it was interesting to see some of the comments,
mm,
because some people were like, this is such a important topic, like, please, thank you for bringing this up. And other people were like, well, you reap what you sow. Like, 57 years old for police is too young, or like too old in my book, or just right. And kind of digging. And two things came up for me just now. I was thinking, first, like, and I even replied on that, you reap what you sow, like that reap what you sow, or you get what you asked for in choosing this, is the exact same narrative that people use to perpetuate and prop up life without the possibility of parole and the death penalty.
Yeah.
And so we have to understand that that sentiment, regardless of who's on the reaping end, is used to harm individuals. And so if you're a true abolitionist who's against this system, then you also have to, the intention of being against the system has to be for the intention of care, right? Like
Yes.
it's to humanize everyone, even those who have perpetrated harm or made mistakes. And so that same kind of grace and compassion and care needs to be given to everyone. And something I was just thinking about is, so we often, like, one of the people commented, like, you have to be real racist to be in that work. And I was thinking about how there's this sentiment around individuals who are police officers or correctional officers, and thinking about, well, what is their incentive? Do they have this power dynamic? All these things. And those same people who question the intention of those officers are the same people who recognize that police officers specifically are the ones who are the only source of support and care for certain individuals. Like, they're the only ones showing up for mental health crises. They're the only ones who are dealing with homelessness. They're the only ones who are attending to drug overdoses, right? Like, we recognize that police, in a way that they shouldn't be, have been tasked to become more than law enforcement. They've been tasked to become these social workers in a way. And yet we still demonize them,
Yeah.
even though we're recognizing that they have to do more.
Hmm. I think it's so interesting. I didn't know we was gonna have this conversation this afternoon, but now that I come to think about it, some of the most staunch abolitionists are law enforcement officers. They have a critique of, like, they know the system doesn't work, right? They know, like you said, they're going to be the people that are going to supporting people that are not going to support them. And I think if we're going to have a true conversation about abolition, I think you're so correct that Cornell West, he so pointedly always talks about having an ethic of care and having an ethic of love. And it's not about, because at the end of the day, if you're a true abolitionist, you know that everybody has the ability or has caused deep harm at some point in some time. And we can't pick and choose
Right.
when we want to enact retribution. We can't pick and choose. Even we're kind of doing the same thing on us. So we can't pick and choose who's redeemable or who's worthy of being reintegrated or being restored back into the community. I think that's something that we have to really wrestle with, even with ourselves in this conversation of abolition.
You know, oh my God, I have so many thoughts running through my head right now. But what I always say, like, you need to be consistent. And
Yeah.
when we think about those who are in prison, like, I've been really trying to work through what is the purpose of prison.
Yeah.
And if we can know, like, when we're talking about crime and we're talking about harm, just as you said, harm and crime are not synonymous. And it's
No.
those in power who get to define what crime is. So thinking about, I was just reading all how, like, Cheetos and Fruit of the Loom, all of these companies are exploiting child labor,
Yeah.
and they're getting away with it. And then the only accountability measure they have right now in place is a $15,000 fee, which for many of these companies is chump change,
Oh
and they're
yeah.
not getting prison time.
We got
Yet,
student loan that's
right,
quadruple 10 times that.
right. And so thinking about how that isn't defined as crime, the people who are supporting and propping up child exploitation are not being imprisoned, they're being fined because they're, masked behind the safety net of the corporation. But then we think of who we put behind bars. And I found this statistic from the National Institute of Health, which is crazy to me, that 85% of the entire prison population either has an active substance abuse disorder or has been incarcerated for a drug-related issue.
Yeah.
And that to me says so much about who we criminalize and who we view as dangerous. And thinking about like, yeah, this redeemability complex. And I just, I don't know, that was so eye-opening to me about our definitions of harm and crime and how power is so deeply entrenched in our social constructs.
I think this is a great time to be talking about what is prison, what are prisons for. The Sentencing Project has launched a new campaign called 50 years of mass incarceration in the wake up, and it's really highlighting the unjust, discriminatory, disproportionate, and ineffective policies of mass incarceration. And I think it's so great to talk about it because we've had 50 years to really kind of understand and see what's happening. And in those 50 years is really interesting is that prisons have not, they're not places where, people say, well, what about the bad people? They're not places where all the bad people are, right? Probably not even a fraction of that. We have to ask ourselves with 50 years, I think 1973, we saw the first 500% increase spike in incarceration. And since then, it's 50 years. We have to ask, so what are we doing? And also, what is the utility of prisons, right?
That's the main question.
We haven't researchers haven't definitively 50 years haven't definitively said what the incapacitation effect is, how much crime is saved or how much violence is reduced by simply having people incarcerated. And I think that's something that we have to chew on.
Well, I think what to me, it seems like the easier route, right? We
Yeah.
know that if 85% of those have a substance abuse disorder, so essentially have a mental health disorder, right? That means that those people are ripe for resources and support and, therapeutic measures, but that takes much more effort than throwing them in a cage. And
Yeah.
I think that prison has just become an easy out.
Yeah.
And when we think about, well, is it keeping us safe? Even if those crimes aren't occurring or harms aren't occurring for the period of an individual's sentence, the fact that we have a 70% reincarceration rate means that what we're like holding back in that time period doesn't really matter because it just shifts on the back end. So
Yeah.
if we're not actually addressing the needs of individuals, then we're not actually increasing public safety. And I think that's where this question has become for me is like, is the intention to enhance public safety? And many people like, or is it to attend to people's needs? And can't those be the same? And I think that people have a really hard time giving up this idea of punishment. They see like, well, they don't deserve treatment. They deserve to be punished. And
Yeah.
so what to me, the question that I always ask my students is we've very clearly been socialized into believing that punishment is necessary for accountability. And I
Yeah.
really want to trace where that belief stems from and whether we can untie the two. Like, is it possible to hold someone accountable for the harm they caused without subjecting them to cruel punishment?
That is a great question. It's something that we need to think seriously about. But even take an example, even if punishment is related or important for accountability, the sustainable aspect is you can't punish people forever.
I think about how we're always taught, or most of us are taught as children, like, be the bigger person and walk away. Like, when someone does harm to you, like, be the bigger person and walk away. Whereas, like, in the criminal legal system, they're like, you punch someone, we're going to punch you back. You killed someone, we're going to kill you back. Like, it's, and I'm not saying to walk away. Like, I do think that we need to resource individuals because there's the undeniable fact that the majority of those in prison are under-resourced, marginalized, oppressed. Like, they are the forgotten ones in so many ways. And yes, there are of course, exceptions to the rule when we think about corporate criminals and like people like Ted Bundy, right? Or the
Mhm.
Menendez brothers. Like we often think of these special cases as like, well, but that demonstrates it's like, no, that's very much the minority. Like if we look at the majority of people, it's those who are under resourced. And
Yeah.
so it it makes sense that you are not addressing people's needs and those needs are leading to them engaging in illegal behavior, and then you're exacerbating those needs by punishing them and putting them in a place where they have no support, they have no community, they have no skills that they're learning, and then you're throwing them back out. Like, of
Yeah.
course we have a 70% reincarceration rate. What would we expect with the system that we have? How would we expect anything different? And yet we still latch on to the idea of punishment because we just want to.
Yeah.
But it's
And
not.
also we've gotten ourselves I'm doing a lecture now in my correctional rehabilitation class. So we've tricked ourselves in thinking that we can punish smarter. And I told my students, anytime you're in any type of uh, policy group or someone reaches out to you and say, "Can we make this punishment better or smarter?" I said, just leave out the room. It's a dead end conversation because we've had 50 years. We try to punish smarter. We created the three strikes law. This idea that people who are committing serious harm, serious offense, the special cases, the bad guys, that they do one felony, two felony, they would be in for life. That didn't end well. We created the death penalty, this idea of punishing smarter, right? That, what about the bad guys? You got people that can kill at an instant's notice. Well, we're going to stop that. That didn't end well. We think about punishing smarter. Only if we could kind of stop and frisk people who we think may be dangerous. And over, time and time again, stop and frisk was violating the human rights of everyday people trying to go to work, people trying to raise their kids. With the three strikes law, we saw that people were getting a third strike for stealing a CD, a bubble gum. Again, we did not get after the most dangerous people. Also, with the death penalty, lots of issues there. And it's this idea that we've been so attracted, focusing on the few. And because we've been focused on the few, it's been affecting the many. What I mean by that is that criminology, we know that only 5 to 9% of really dangerous people, really motivated people will kind of constitute for over 30, 40% of the crime. And
Right.
basically what we've done is we've tried to lock in and zero in on that few. And because we've kind of been focused on the few, we've sacrificed the many. Majority of people are not conducive to crime. How do we care for those people? How do we make those people better? How do we think about their lives? What are the social structures? Instead of saying, let's just keep on trying to figure out who the bad people are and kind of creating a system, which we have mass incarceration. We see that, Paul Butler tells us who's the person who's incarcerated is the kid who went to your church, is the person from high school, is the sweaty kids that are on your block. These are normal, everyday people. And even though we have again arrested probably some people who have done some serious things, but we just haven't done a good job in 50 years of really going after the bad guys. And so we have to think about, do we want to continue for 50 more years or several decades later of sacrificing the many for the few?
Right. And I think I always like feel pause when we even evoke the term bad guys or talk about
Yeah.
because like, yes, and we've said this, yeah, of course, like we've said this multiple times in this YouTube series where there is, even if you have all the resources in community, well, we've never really had that model. So we
Yeah.
don't know if like there would still be people who commit dangerous acts. But let's just hypothesize that even if we had all the resources in the community, there might still be some individuals who would go out and commit acts of violence and harm
Yeah,
people.
for sure.
So we understand that there are individuals who are so under resourced that they need to be immediately removed from their situation. And so this is where I think the Norwegian model and Little Scandinavia comes in for me, where I'm like, okay, if we think about where those individuals would have to go in order to get resources, because there's obviously a lack thereof, then this model might be a step in the right direction, right? Thinking about, okay, if we limit the individuals who we are incapacitating to those who have no remorse, to those who are repeatedly engaging in harmful behavior because of something that's going unsupported or unaddressed, then where can we go with that individual to address it? And so
Mm,
thinking about, okay, maybe it's a place like this where individuals are still able to have some level of autonomy, are still able to have some level of dignity and humanity and feel some rate of normality, but are in a space where they can feel safe, where they are looked after, where they are supported, because clearly in the environment they were in the community, they were not. And
yeah.
like, I think there's yeah, it could be like part of the abolitionist agenda, but I do think, like, going back, there is always an assumption that people are going to act harmfully. Like, there's always an assumption that there's going to be violence, but we've never had a scenario in America. Like, America is predicated on inequality and racism. It's literally predicated on slavery. And so we've never really had a situation where like a more socialist and even communist, like a commune, right? Like, where everyone has a share, everyone is invested in the different aspects of the community, right? They are employee owned companies, and everyone has a stake and takes turns doing different roles. Like, we've never really had that scenario. And so we don't know, if we had the right resources, if we had more equality, would there be the same level of harm being committed? I really doubt it. But of course, we don't know. And so the assumption, because we've been so deeply embedded in inequality and so deeply embedded in harm and danger, we only can assume that it would be the same.
Yeah, I think, thinking about little Scandinavia, I was thinking about the question that's kind of implicit in there is the idea, can you kind of have some type of humane programming in a prison? I'm not really optimistic about that.
No, me neither.
I would say I'm hopeful. I use the words according to what I say I'm hopeful because hope says despite seeing the evidence that we can kind of have a change. So I will say I'm hopeful that that can happen. But one of the things we know just from a research perspective, we think about the Zimbardo prison experiments, right? You take white 10, 12 white healthy men and you separate them. We know that those type of conditions can be coercive. A lot of great Netflix documentary. But also, I think as we think about a step in the right direction, I always think about that even if we try to create more and more humane efforts, um, if we're true, like prison has like origins in slavery, like how humane can you make suffering?
Right.
Like how humane, you might can it might can be tolerable to a point, but I don't think it's a place for any human being to be. Not saying that we don't want to hold people accountable, but I think that's what pushes me to the abolition framework. Like, what is the system or a new system by which we can do these particular things? And what I say with that is that a lot of the systems that are created in our society were often created without everyone in mind. You
Mm,
think about the workforce, right? There's a pay equity gap between men and women, right? We're seeing that a lot in sports, and that's getting a lot of headway between the WNBA and NBA facilities and
yeah.
different things. I think so. When I think about this in main setting, I think about a system, a new system that's created with everyone in mind as we think about the prison system, because that's not the origins of it. And I think Little Scandinavia gives us a hint. I think it works well for Norway. And also, I was very curious with Dr. Hyatt about how they even adopted it for it to move forward. I know they had the meeting here, but it was very interesting that they did those things. And if they could have a little Scandinavia, that tells me that we can be open to all other types of possibilities. And so I wonder, if we talk to our state officials and the Secretary of Prisons, what is the system that we can now think of now that we have so many examples, 50 years incarceration, we have people who have life sentences. who have gone home. We have people, I know people who was actually on death row for 14 years who are exonerated and had their sentence home. Can we all think together and co-create a process or a system where we can have everyone in mind to think about what this process looks like moving forward?
Yeah. Yeah. I think about little Scandinavia and the idea of like still having people sleeping in cages and
Yeah.
still having people in there with life sentences. And yeah, I feel a lot of doubt. I like the idea. I think it would have to be in a different setting because the issue is that like little Scandinavia or not, prison is on your record. And they don't like an employer isn't going to be like, "Oh, you were in the little Scandinavia model." Like, "Oh, you must be a great employee." Like, no, the stigma's still there. And so that's
Right.
the question that we have to like ask is even if we move toward implementing great programs in prison, the stigma of prison doesn't go away, right? You're
Yeah, that's true.
still seen as an ex-inmate, an ex-con, an ex-felon. It's it the you are defined by your past. The ex doesn't even really mean anything. You're still just seen as a felon. You're still
Yeah.
just seen as an inmate. You're still just seen as someone who is dangerous to be around, regardless of the fact that a judge sentenced you to a time period where your release was seen as the time that you would be safe to be around.
Yeah.
And yet there's still so many barriers and so much stigma. And so, how do we implement these new systems and rid the stigma? Like that's a big question that I just thought of right now that I need to like explore.
Yeah, how do we remove the stigma? And that's something that we need to think about systematically. Who said that people need to have a criminal record? Who said that that's the way that things have to be? Who said that people need rap? What are rap sheets for? What are criminal records for? If people have paid their debts to society, do they are able after a certain minute to get those things marked clean? Also, when we think about the future of prisons, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to be in the businesses of changing people's life courses,
Right.
changing their life trajectories? Because one of the things that we fail to understand is that no matter what the person is, and I think those other institutions, hospitals, rehab centers, understand that people are still developing. And so we are tinkering and playing, literally playing with people's development, right? If you remove them away from their families, it's
Right.
so interesting. I had a conversation with a faculty member who went on sabbatical for 1 year, full year, and he had some first year PhD students. And he said the first year, the PhD students, he was like, they were very frantic, anxious, kind of, head down. And he said when he came up the sabbatical, they had their head up, they had all these great ideas. And he said, just in that short year, their development had grown
Mm,
so much. And so we have to think about when people are away for 1 year, 3 years,
right.
5 years, 10 years or more, that people are growing in ways that are totally different. And so I think we're this year, next couple years, we're going to think critically about these. I believe they say like even more people are going to be coming home who had long sentences like in 2030.
Right.
Also, the racial mix is going to look different in like 2030s. And so
Right.
all of these systems that we're going to have to acknowledge. I think even critically about when all the flights were delayed because they said the air traffic control has just been using a system that's like started like early 1940s, 50s or something like that. And so we just have to say, what are we going to do about our systems, right? All of our systems. But when we're talking about it, especially our criminal justice system.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that it's been 50 years of mass incarceration and we haven't really seen any movement on the 70% reincarceration rate, like that stat hasn't really moved in 50 years. So clearly, punishing just for the sake of punishment doesn't actually keep us safe. So I think, yeah, the questions that I think our audience should walk away from this conversation with are what is the purpose of prison?
Yeah.
Even if we had better kinds of housing or programming within the prison setting, is it possible to remove stigma? And also thinking about the well-being of everyone, right? Like we started this conversation thinking about correctional officers and police officers and actors within the system who are equally or not equally, who are definitely traumatized and impacted. Like, can we think of a system that has an ethic of care that therefore has a positive impact on everyone involved?
Yeah. And I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, I think you had talked to Dr. Hyatt about the study itself, and he was saying, little Scandinavia has kind of decreased prison misconducts and behavior, but are there other
Yeah.
metrics that we want to capture about well-being
Right.
that's really important? And I think we have to think more critically about just out of arrest and even recidivism, right? And thinking about our articles of what are prisons for, is that also what type of success metrics do we want to see,
Yeah.
right? If we acknowledge that bad people exist, do we want them to be good people, right? Do we want them, what does a good person, what does that entail, and how do we track those metrics? Because arrest and recidivism doesn't really tell us really anything
Yeah.
about that, about the stigma. There's people who've been arrested, who come from wealthier backgrounds, so we may not know, it doesn't mean they're a good person. And so we have to think about, I mean, our president is, in a lot of, he's in the court every day, a new charge every day. And so we have to think critically about this idea. What do we want our prisons, what function do we want them to serve as well? And I think that's something we have to continue ask ourselves.
Yeah. What does it mean to be a bad person and what does it mean to be a good person? That's
Mhm.
such an important question because I think our label of bad, we don't actually think about what goes into it and what makes someone a bad person. And it's usually just like being under resourced,
Yeah, and we
and
don't want the
again, like,
context.
and
Yeah, we
that's
don't want the context.
yeah, like being saying someone is under resource, like saying that I think catches people where they're like, but they did something bad, like they killed someone, they raped someone, they like molested a 3-year-old kid, like they're a bad person. How can you say that they're just under resourced? And it's like, to me, again, we are a collection of our experiences, our environment, what we've gone through. And so again, this isn't to say like that person shouldn't be held accountable for committing harm, but what does accountability look like? And what is our intention in accountability? Like, is it to heal and focus on the individual who is victimized? Because our prison for sure doesn't fucking do that. Like this, we have who is the criminal legal system for? There are too many questions. So yeah, there are
A
too
lot
many.
of questions.
Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.